The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi is responsible for a lot of things in history. One of them is algebra or algebra in Arabic. He's also responsible for algorithm, but for the most part, he's responsible for formalizing mathematics and making it seem as if it is a path rather than the destination. And so, creating very simple paths, he was able to create mathematical patterns. This is interesting, but it's not everything that he did. He also contributed to science, light, and all those things. At the time, you did not just do one thing. You weren't a mathematician, full stop. You weren't just a geographer, full stop. And in following this tradition, Isaac Newton did the same. Now, I've talked about Isaac Newton and his contributions to history because he, of course, wrote down history books, which were wildly accurate and then wildly inaccurate in some ways. This is due to the fact that Isaac Newton, unlike this person, was not as interested. This person, Al Khwarizmi, what he did was venture far in terms of his tentacles. So he got people to travel for him and come back with the information. And then using all of his brain, he would document the places. One of the places mentioned is this ruined castle from Gao. Gao is the only civilization that was a true competitor to the Kingdom of Ghana. We know that he was referring to Gao because he also mentions the Kingdom of Ghana as a competitor. This is more information than a lot of other people had at the time. This is a page from Al Khwarizmi's book when he's detailing geography of Africa. And right here, what you're looking at is the Nile. The information that is written and the stories make it clear that he had a pretty good look, a pretty good understanding of what he was talking about. He was less interested in history as he was geography, unlike Isaac Newton, who was more interested in history than he was geography. The people of Gao would then be transformed by the Songhai, and then they would be transformed again by the Mali Empire and so many other empires that existed in that region, including ones located in Nigeria. It's odd to talk about the history of these people because a lot of it is documented by the people who took them over. One book that goes back into the history and talks about the fact that this civilization predated them is a book called Tariq al Sudan, written in Timbuktu. This book details several dynasties from the era that it was written, going back all the way to Gao. Although Gao by itself is a region that held a lot of power and again stood up against the Empire of Ghana and against incoming Tuareg people, it's seen in this book as a mere province or a mere smaller state of the people living in the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire is discussed extensively because, of course, the Mali Empire is involved with the Almoravids, it's involved with so many other Arabic slash African people who went all the way to Spain, all the way to North Africa, and even, according to a lot of books from Timbuktu, traveled south to a kingdom which is not named, which is probably the Kingdom of Congo, and southeast to the Swahili coast. Before I go on, I want to explain exactly what this civilization was like in a sense, because of course it had major trade as you would expect. It had all types of civilization. In fact, one of the things that is noticed about it is that, and this is a story that came from outside the kingdom, but one of the stories is that the king once wanted to go to a meeting, but because all the smaller kings refused, he couldn't go. This tells you about the type of situation or type of civilization it was. So let's read this for a second. Before the slave trade and the colonial rule by the West African attained at its economic and social apogee with Ghana State, Mali Empire, and Gawa Empire, but our knowledge is limited due to the scarceness of the historical documents. The article attempts to give a new light on the social and economic foundations of the Gawa state. Before 10th century, being based on data acquired through our archaeological research in Mali, our excavations in Gawa Sane site found a building made of a rectangular mud brick, more than 400 glass and metal beads, oil lamps, 100 of iron and copper items, a few spindles, and small crucibles. Also were found two kinds of copper boards in the shape of a sickle, which people should have circulated as money and have melted down to manufacture copper artifacts. The C14 analysis shows that this site would have been occupied between 8th and 10th century. The existence of different types of earthenware should be a reflection of the coexistence of different peoples. Indigenous African people and the immigrant from North Africa, if the interpretation be correct, it will situate the beginning of a trans-Saharan commerce before 8th century, one of the 2 centuries earlier than the commonly held view. Our excavation at Gawa Ancient found big buildings totally made of stone of 36 meters in length and 12.5 meters wide. Other findings include 10,000 glass and stone beads, more than 1,000 iron and copper items, 100 of fragments of glassware and porcelain imported from North Africa. The C14 analysis shows that this building would have been constructed in the first half of the 10th century and abandoned before the end of the same century. The stone building being inextant near the site, its owner should have been able to mobilize large quantities of manpower. This suggests, with the large scale of buildings, the existence of a valuable imported goods, that the building was a royal palace. The interpretation being correct, it is first discovery of medieval royal palace done by West African archaeology. Our findings in Gao, ancient and Gao Sanis testify the historical records written in 10th century by Arab geographers, which speak of a twin city of Gao composed of a royal residence and commercial center. They also clarify the modality of the manufacturers and the commercial networks in West Africa between the 8th and 10th century. Given what we know about the artifacts found there, the stone buildings, and the type of people that would traverse or go through that area, and I've already talked about one of them who came from North Africa and went all the way to the Ghana Empire, it's no surprise that Muslim scholars were aware of places like this. And the reason why it's no surprise is because we find items that come from very far away in this region. And as rich as this region is, it's probably due to trade. That's 90% of civilizations around the world, no matter where they come from. It has to do with them having some other civilization pour in so that they can become rich. Because internally, you come up with some good ideas, but they will ultimately have a cap until somebody else comes in and reinvigorates the culture with new ideas. Now, of course, because the civilization is this old, all we have are ruins. And the people located in this area, even though they're known, It's I'm not going to mention them now because they're for another episode. But the people located in this region, as you can imagine, were moving over and over again. Probably one of the most important things about this movement was that it joined several tribes that used to belong to different places. And even after the civilizations afterwards fell, then suddenly they belonged again. For example, the Sanhaja Berbers would soon belong to one of the empires there, I think the Mali Empire. The so many people would then belong to the Mali Empire, and then they would split up after a while. So it tells you that the cultures, this is where multiculturalism comes in. It tells you that the cultures became one kingdom, but they did not become one entity in a sense, because when they split up, they still kept their own customs. As we read here, the strategic importance of Gao did not diminish during the historical period. Early Arabic texts concerning Bilad al-Sudan. Remember, Bilad al-Sudan is that thing that I showed you from that 800 AD, which is about the same time as this, 800 AD book by al-Masudi, where he says the extent of Bilad al-Sudan or al-Sudan is starts in Morocco. So from Morocco going down, that entire area belongs to the Sudan. The other one, he says, belongs to merchants and whatever. And he mentions that there are different types of people located in that area, but the majority being black, some under the control of the now moving Arabic states that didn't get rid of the native populations, but took over. And then as time would go on, they would replace the entire populations one by one, some of them moving them all the way south, which is probably why a lot of the people in Africa do not have like 50% or 60% Arabic DNA, but instead start with a very small DNA. But let's come back to that. Let's read this. The strategic importance of Gao did not diminish in the text of Al Khwarizmi written before his death in 846 to 847, which is the oldest extant document referring to West Africa cities Gao or sites Gao as one of the main towns of West Africa, together with Ghana and Zagawa. Leibniz and Hopkins, 1981, according to Al Yaqubi, who wrote in 872 and 873, Gao was the greatest of the realms of Sudan, the most important and powerful of all the kingdoms obey its king. Al Kauka is the name of the town. In the book by al-Bakri, he notes the Kitab Futa al-Buldan, or the book of the Islamic Empire or Islamic State, or the spread of the Islamic State. And as you can see, the map provided gives you a good amount of where Muslims had spread. These Muslims, though spread maybe violently in those areas, were more peaceful in their spread in places like Gao, because they were completely out of the way and soldiers really didn't penetrate in those regions because there was so many armies in those regions. Again, the Swahili coast as well had first, because we read in Al Masudi that the only place they had taken over in the Swahili coast, or they had taken over, let's just use that word, was Kilwa. And Kilwa was taken over by an Ethiopian from what we call today modern Somalia. And so Sudan, in a weird sense, Bilad al Sudan, or the area of Sudan, and there's, by the way, the area of Sudan is different than the Zanj regions, which is different than the Abyssinian regions. But you can use the word Sudan to refer to those regions as well. But the entire region of the Negroes was basically self taught. In other words, they converted themselves into Islam. And this is why there's so many people in West Africa that were given the title where it's given every 100 years for someone who is returning Islam back to its original state. But over here it didn't qualify because in Islam was being introduced. So to put some context, al-Bakri is from Al-Andalus. So this is from the takeover. It's already been taken over um the top of Spain. So Al-Andalus already belongs to, or at least the Iberian regions have been taken over. So it already belongs to the Moor Muslims combination. And this is what they had to say. So this is Al-Bakri, the one I was being talking about. So let's just start with the intro. This is from Cambridge, by the way. Abu Ubaid al-Bakri, a historian and geographer from Muslim Spain. Al-Bakri wrote in Arabic and learned about Ghana, talking to Arab and Berber North African merchants who have traveled in Africa. He also used older writings by travelers to West Africa. So that's interesting that there's older writings. Some of them don't exist anymore, but there were older writings about West Africa prior to him, and I've talked about some of them. Oh, before I finish reading, because you're like, oh, aren't we talking about Gao? Why are we talking about Ghana? Al-Bakri assumed that Gao was a capital of Ghana, and that's where he talks about twin cities. As we read, the city of Ghana consists of two towns, situated on a plain. One of these towns, which is inhabited by Muslims, is large and possesses 12 mosques in which they assemble for the Friday prayer. There are salaried imams and muezzins, as well as jurists and scholars. In the environs are wells with sweet water from which they drink, and with which they grow vegetables. The king's town is 6 miles distant from this one. Between these are two towns, are continuous habitations. In the king's town, and not far from his court of justice, is a mosque where the Muslims who arrive at his court pray around the king's town, are domed buildings and groves and thickets where the sorcerers of these people, men in charge of the religious cult, live in them too, are their idols and the tombs of their kings. These woods are guarded, and none may enter them and know what it is there. The king's interpreters, the official in charge of the treasury, and majority of his ministers are Muslims. Among the people who follow the king's religion, only he and his heir apparent, who is the son of his sister, may wear sewn clothes. All other peoples wear robes of cotton silks and brocades according to their means. All of them shave their beards, and the women shave their heads. The kings adorn himself like a woman, wearing necklaces round his neck and bracelets on his forearms, and he puts on a high cap decorated with gold and wrapped in a turban of fine cotton. He sits in the audience or to hear grievances against officials in the domed pavilion around which stand 10 horses covered with gold embroidered materials. Behind the king stands 10 pages holding shields and swords decorated with gold, and on his right are the sons of the vassal kings of his country wearing splendid garments and their hair plated with gold. The governor of the city sits on the ground before the king, and around him are ministers seated likewise. At the door of the pavilion are dogs of of excellent pedigree who hardly ever leave the place where the king is, guarding him. Round their necks they wear collars of gold, and silver studded with number of balls of the same metals. The audience is announced by the beating of the drum, which they call duba, made from a long hollow log. When the people who profess the same religion as the king approach him, they fall on their knees and sprinkle dust on their head, for this is their way of greeting him, as for Muslims they greet him only by clapping their hands. Gao continued to be an important place under that same name until the 13th century. By the 13th century, new rivals had come, new enemies with bigger intentions, namely the Mansas. These Mansas did damage on Gao, and Gao disappeared for a while. But then it returned under the Songhai Empire. And when it returned, it became bigger than what it used to be. Probably the most important thing that happened during the time of Gao is the spread of the Mali Empire. And this spread of the Mali Empire created something completely new and the wealth that came from it. I mean, you can imagine they started with such a strong foundation. You can imagine the power that they held. And from the Mali Empire, we have, of course, Mansa Musa, who went to Egypt and he completely communicated in a completely different way than what was there before, showing the strength of the civilization. Of course, the Mansa, which has been given two names, I'm not going to name them, but who went all the way to the Americas, whether they made it or not my concern, but who went all the way to the Americas, and even having a story like that tells you that these people were in such wealth that they could spend on just about anything. And of course, this Mansa would go to Egypt, and Al Umari would write about him and say exactly how rich he was. And so when the Songhai took over, you can imagine what was what they inherited in this one specific region. While the Arabs did not come with bad intentions for a fairly long time, the entity that would come in the 15 to 1600s was a little different. These images represent Elimna Castle, first set up by the Portuguese. It was set up as a trading area which was used mainly to trade slaves to the Americas. In the beginning, it was set up to control West African trade. So anything that came from West Africa, it Portugal wanted dibs on it, wanted the first supply of it, so then it could trade it around the world for crazy prices. Before the setup of this castle, though, one of the people that was very important to the Portuguese who came to this region was none other than Christopher Columbus. And so we know that Christopher Columbus must have learned a thing or two from these Africans, especially their sailing. Anyway, that is Gao. It's not the full story of Gao, but the full story of Gao can only come if you discuss the full story of Mali, which is another episode.